Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today I'm going to try something slightly different to normal. I'm just going to teach you what's on the screen, but I'm going to get a transcript of what I'm saying and post that within the video so you can get these as subtitles and hopefully learn from that. So I'm thinking about how can you be tactical in your revision and pick one theme that's going to allow you to learn everything else about the play. So I'm going to show you how to look at the supernatural in Macbeth to do that. Let's begin with Macbeth himself. So clearly the witches think they will have most influence on Macbeth, which is why they address him first. They give him the three promises, and Banquo has to say, "Speak then to me. If you can see into the seeds of time and see which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me." He has to beg them for an answer, but because they don't think they're going to be able to influence Banquo as much as they can influence Macbeth. So clearly we can see right from the very beginning that the supernatural depends on the character of the person that they're acting on. Now, if we consider it a bit more deeply, the witches, the weird sisters, never tell Macbeth to do anything at all. They don't tell him any action which he must commit. So we can clearly see from this that Shakespeare wants us to blame Macbeth for taking the decision to commit regicide. It is entirely his decision. In fact, he gives Macbeth the words of he reflects on being crowned without my stir. In other words, Macbeth realizes that if the supernatural prophecy is correct, doesn't mean he has to do anything about it. It's simply fate. He will simply become king in the matter of course. Another way in which Macbeth gives the weird sisters a supernatural power is that he actually goes to seek them out again in order to find out what's going to happen once he is king. And this is Shakespeare's way of again pointing out that Macbeth's decline is not because of the witches. It is because he seeks out their power. He allows them to control his thoughts. Right, well now let's look at their effect on Lady Macbeth. She is entranced by Macbeth's letter, which tells her of the witches' prophecies, and immediately that she reads it, she begins to call upon a supernatural power. She says, "Come, you murdering ministers that tend on mortal thoughts." And that addition of "that tend on mortal thoughts" is Shakespeare again signalling that it's not the supernatural that necessarily has power. They tend on mortal thoughts, meaning attend, they wait for the mortal thought, but it is that thought which sets things into action. So it is Lady Macbeth's thoughts that gives the supernatural power again. Now, we can clearly see that both of these characters are punished for their belief in the supernatural. So one reading of the play is that Shakespeare is simply pointing out that if you turn to supernatural means, God will restore order by punishing you. And that is a view that the majority of his audience would have accepted quite happily. But this is a little teaser for you for when we get to consider King James, because he had a passionate belief in the power of witches. He thought they had real power to influence the weather to such an extent that he believed they created a storm off the coast of Scotland to try to sink a ship in which he was sailing in order to assassinate him. So we're actually looking at a situation where Shakespeare is saying, did they really though, King James, did they really have that power? Quite a dangerous thing for him to suggest. So later in the play, he's going to include things to suggest that they did have that power. Let's look at how those things affect Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So the first question the director has to ask themselves when they think about the supernatural is, will the dagger which Macbeth sees leading him towards Duncan, will it actually appear on stage? Now, if it doesn't appear on stage, one interpretation is that this is Macbeth doing it to himself. It is his own inner ambition and the corruption of his thoughts that's causing him to hallucinate this dagger with blood on its blade, leading him towards Duncan. However, the scene can be staged with the witches on stage at the same time, in which case you would be suggesting that the witches are controlling this hallucination, this vision. You can stage it even further by having one of the witches holding the dagger in front of Macbeth. But you would only do this if you wanted to show that the supernatural had real power. Another way in which he suggests that the supernatural might have real power is through the arrival of Banquo's ghost. So if Banquo's ghost is visible to the audience, and nearly every director chooses for the ghost to be real, then that suggests that there is a real supernatural power. But here, it's not a power controlled by the witches. If Banquo's ghost is real, this is kind of a vengeful power, perhaps a symbol of God's justice. So God becomes the supernatural power who sends Banquo to condemn Macbeth and eventually drive him to madness because of what he's done in killing his best friend and, obviously, not to forget, killing Duncan the King. But Shakespeare is still passionately interested in the psychology of his characters. So, even though we see Banquo on stage appearing as a ghost, this could still be a vision of Macbeth's guilt. It doesn't have to be a supernatural appearance at all. We can see the character on stage, but still believe this is merely a representation of the power of Macbeth's guilt. And one of the ways that Shakespeare draws that out is he makes sure that none of the other characters can see Banquo, even Lady Macbeth, who must also feel guilty. One of the ways that he gives his audience what they want in rejecting the supernatural is through the creation of Macduff. And this prophecy, beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife, which fits exactly with Macbeth's mood, is then followed up with no man of woman born can take your life, Macbeth, is what they say to him. And so he believes that he's impossible to kill by a man born of a woman. When Macduff finds this out in their final battle, he says to Macbeth, "Despair thy charm." And so this is an attack on the supernatural. He's saying that the supernatural is not a charm, and in fact you should despair at it. So he's giving the Elizabethan view, which is now the Jacobean view, that we should have nothing to do with prophecy and witchcraft and charms because they're anti-Christian. And to prove that, Macduff then kills Macbeth to restore the natural order and bring the kingship of Malcolm. However, the ending of the play that restores Malcolm to the throne doesn't actually set everything right. It's quite deceptive because the events of the play have told us that the witches' prophecies have come true. So there is a kind of supernatural power at work, and this would agree with King James's view of the world. And the reason we know that they have this supernatural vision is, well, Macbeth does become the Thane of Cawdor, and he does become the king, just as the witches promised. And then the warnings that they gave him, that he didn't have to worry until Birnam Wood came up the hill, and he didn't have to worry because none of woman born could kill him, also proved to be true. Birnam Wood, in this trick way, did come up the hill, and Macduff, being of woman born, not of woman born by caesarean, that prophecy also came true. So here Shakespeare is giving King James a world in which the supernatural really does have power. But this asks us to think, well, how then will Banquo's son Fleance become king and follow Malcolm? And one possibility is that Malcolm will also become a very bad king and therefore be deposed by Fleance. And another reason for that is that Fleance is supposed to be the ancestor of King James. That's what was believed at the time. And so Shakespeare wouldn't want to portray Fleance as an evil character like Macbeth who kills the rightful king Malcolm. He needs Fleance to be a good king. And that suggests that he might have to challenge Malcolm in order to replace him and restore order. Now, that directly links King James's kingship to the witch's prophecy again. And that is also pandering to King James's belief in the supernatural. Now, why is that important? Why do I keep going on about King James's belief? Well, in 1605, King James has appointed Shakespeare as his lead playwright, and he's made his company of actors the King's Players. So Shakespeare is suddenly elevated to the most important theatre owner and acting company manager in London and therefore in the country. He has King James's ear. Even more important than that, Macbeth wasn't first performed for a wider audience. It was performed at the court of King James, at his palace, for the nobility. So Shakespeare's a businessman, and he needs to give King James a play that he will absolutely agree with. So you probably know that King James wrote a book about witchcraft called Demonology, and Shakespeare is actually appealing to the king's sense of vanity here. He's offering King James a kind of agreement that, yes, I believe this world of the supernatural influencing us in the real world is also real, and here's my play that plays that out and shows the consequences of any kind of trust in witchcraft. The other reason for the theme of the supernatural is that it's simply entertaining to the audience in the way that we would go and watch a horror film. And this play is actually full of horror and violence. There are more references to blood in Macbeth than any other play Shakespeare wrote. It's simply something that the audience would love. However, he's very careful that he doesn't use what he calls a bloody instruction. And these are Macbeth's words. He worries that by killing the king, he will teach bloody instruction, and that instruction, that lesson, is that it's okay to kill the king. It's okay, therefore, to kill Macbeth once he's killed Duncan. And that's in fact what happens. Now, by making Macbeth's killing of Duncan so clearly linked to supernatural power of the witches, Macbeth is sending a political message to all the nobles at court. And what he's saying is, if you want to get rid of this king, and of course many of them did, then what you would be doing is committing a supernaturally evil act. You would be acting, if you like, with the power of Satan rather than with the king, who is directly appointed by God in Jacobean and Elizabethan belief. And this comes back to the idea of the great chain of being. I might as well deal with it now. So the idea here is that God has set up a hierarchy which cannot be changed, and that's why it's called a chain. And the greatness comes from, right at the top is God, then you have his angels, and beneath that you have God's appointment of power on earth, who is the king. In Catholic belief, it would have been the Pope, but you probably remember that King Henry VIII got rid of Catholicism, outlawed it as a form of religion in the country, and replaced himself as the head of the church. So Queen Elizabeth and now King James I are both the heads of the church. Consequently, to act against the king is to act against God and therefore condemn yourself to a life of hell. And that, of course, is the moral message of Lady Macbeth, She, if you like, symbolically goes to hell when she commits suicide, and similarly Macbeth is confined to hell. He deliberately uses the word damned in his final speech with Macduff in order to remind the audience that that is his eventual fate. His soul is going to suffer eternal torment and damnation in hell. So, upsetting the great chain of being is another way of upsetting the natural order and providing disorder. This is why Lady Macbeth criticises Macbeth when he sees Banquo's ghost. She says that he has caused a most admired disorder, and she focuses on this word because the job of a king is to provide order. It's to provide security, and that is what Macbeth doesn't offer as a king. Interestingly, it's not so much that he has taken kingship by force, it's that he continues to use force and violence to rule, and that's what leads to the disorder in his society. Now, this would be a dangerous interpretation because this would be saying, yeah, actually it is okay to kill the king, and the gunpowder plot has just happened, and this could be a way of interpreting the play as saying actually getting rid of King James wouldn't be such a bad thing. So to counteract that, Shakespeare makes sure that he has these descriptions of horses eating each other in the night when Duncan is killed, because he wants to show that the supernatural power of having the king killed has led to supernatural events in nature that are a disorder. The natural world is upset, it no longer conforms to expectations, and horses suddenly become cannibalistic and turn on each other and eat each other. Therefore, what could be worse than that? Nothing is his message, so consequently what he's saying is that having King James as the natural king is the natural order, and no matter how much you as another noble might not want him to be king, you simply have to put up with it because this is God's will. And that's the political message of the play. That's why the witches are included in it, to satisfy King James's vanity and interests, and also to satisfy Shakespeare's need to stay on the right side of the king in order to remain the most successful playwright of his day. Right, so a different sort of video from me. Please let me know in your comments whether going through the theme in this way has helped you, or whether you'd prefer a different sort of video. When I upload this, it'll take me some time to upload the script as well, but look out for that mid-March and so forth. And as usual, thank you very much for watching.